welcome to the Ground Investigation. Today's guest is the one and only Ed Medley, the true legend in the geotechnical and geological engineering world. With a career spanning over 45 years, Ed has worn many hats that most of us can count. Consultant, researcher, professor, mentor, expert witness, and even artifact retriever in lava tubes. Known for his groundbreaking work on BIM rocks, his love of chaos, both geotechnical and otherwise, and his knack for storytelling, Ed has lived a career and life that's anything but ordinary. Prepare to be entertained, inspired, and maybe even challenged. Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So as we just mentioned, your career spans over 45 years with diverse roles in consulting, teaching, and even litigation. How would you summarize your professional philosophy?
Well, to use the word philosophy for somebody like me is a little formal. So, my career and the way I do my work is mostly been inspired by intuition and a sense of adventure. Overall, I would say if I had a philosophy, it's to do the very best that I can in whatever it is that I have been doing, and that's really, I guess, probably a pretty good philosophy for most people.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the best philosophies you can ever really have in life, I think, because I'm sure that leads to good things.
I'll say that what really guides me are a number of mantras that I developed over the years. Nothing is simple. Nothing is what it seems to be. Nothing stays the same. In the fullness of time, excellence is not convenient. Periodically, those little mantras have been very useful to me in my career.
Yeah, mantras are certainly useful when things get tough, especially, I find.
Yeah.
So you've described your career path as a random walk. What's the most surprising or unplanned turn your career has taken so far?
Probably very early on, probably the first one. I emigrated to Canada in 1969. Up to that point, I'd been working in the sort of fledgling computer business. And I decided I want to go to Canada. I worked my way to Canada on a washing dishes on a Norwegian cargo ship, and arrived in Toronto in early February with a need to do something. Um, and I had an idea about what I wanted to do, but I needed money, and I applied for a job with International Nickel for their mines in Sudbury, and they accepted me. And then they turned me down during the medical because of my hearing. I never realized my hearing. I have a very severe hearing loss. Anyway, that got me really interested in mining, and I BS'd my way into a job with a geophysical company called Syntrax at a conference that was coincidentally being held nearby. And I then started essentially the first step in several years of mineral exploration prospect. And that first job was a data man on a helicopter geophysics crew. And from there on, I ended up blasting and claim staking and banging rocks with hammers and over several years. So that was the very first and completely unexpected. Kid from Acton in West London ends up flying around in helicopters in the bush and having adventures with bears and whatnot. So that was the first one. Let me just mention the second one. The second one was after I'd done all this mineral exploration, a guy who was very influential in my life told me I should go back to school and get a degree in geology so I could learn what it was I was doing. And that was a major lurch because I left school with 2 A levels, one in economics, one in geography, D level. I've been kicked out of science early on in my second form, I think it was, math in my fourth form. And so I had this challenge, which was to go to university and to study geological engineering. And I had no math or science background. So that was very unexpected. Anyway, those are 2 steps.
And how challenging was it to not have the maths or science background to then go into the geological engineering side?
Let me just say that my first homework for my first course on the first day, the first question was how many cubic centimeters are there in 0.87 cubic meters? And I couldn't do it. It was so frustrating, and I ended up crying. And I just got married, and anyway, my wife got me through it. So let me tell you that the 5-year geological engineering program at UBC was was the hardest project of my whole life. So learning engineering and math, partial differential equations, and all that kind of stuff was a big challenge.
Yeah, I bet it was. Yeah, I mean, I've never really went down that route myself in terms of the more kind of geotechnical engineering sense, I suppose. I was more kind of out on site, doing the hard graft of getting rained on in sunburnt in summer. But of course, there's lots of good things to be had from a lot of site experience as well. Right, hey, so
Struggling to find top geotechnical and geoenvironmental talent? You could use a generalist recruiter, or you could use a specialist. At Geo Expert Search, we place experts where they belong. Across the UK, USA, Australia, and New Zealand. No highways, no bridges, no structures. Just geotechnical and geoenvironmental. Now and forever. Geo Expert Search. Finding the right people for the right roles with no wasted time. Visit geoexpertsearch.com to learn more.
in your experience, how has the field of geological engineering evolved since you began your career?
Well, let's just decide what we mean by geological engineering. It's not an expression that's commonly heard in the UK. In fact, it's not even common in the United States. I think geological engineering is on the spectrum of geology all the way through to engineering, is on the engineering, more on the engineering side. So I'm a geological engineer. All right. The closest to it are engineering geologists in the UK who have had their training, academic training at a really excellent schools like Royal School of Mines or Portsmouth or Exeter or Newcastle in engineering geology, where there's a lot of mechanics, a lot of science. So that's more the flavor. So anyway, how has it changed? It's changed incredibly and dramatically. Geological engineering at the University of British Columbia, when I started, um, uh, was mineral exploration, geotechnical engineering, applied geophysics. And it's geological engineering is very common in Canada. The professional registration is geological engineering. It's so it was a huge mix of rock mechanics, rock engineering, mining engineering, soils engineering, lots of groundwater. I mean, it was a 5-year program crammed with stuff. That the academic field of geological engineering has had to change in the last 40 years because of the demands of our professions. Life has become far more complicated, particularly in geotechnical engineering. My geotechnical engineering was rock mechanics, rock engineering, soil, groundwater. Nowadays, geotechnical engineering, particularly here in California, is soil mechanic only. So it's specialized to that extent. And so geological engineering has become split into various specializations, of course. The opportunities are vast. Now you have, major infrastructure developments. You have lifeline roads and railways and water problems. We have, deep foundations, tunneling, environmental issues to the max. All of that has increased since I was a student in the 70s. And so where it was expected that you would either go into mineral exploration, which many people did, resource, oil, tar sands, coal, or the few of us that actually went into geotechnical engineering. So there were 8 students when I graduated. 4 of them went into oil. And now it's 40 to 45 students every year, and they've got a variety of industry. So it's a very broad field now. That's how it changed.
Yes, no, that's quite a dramatic difference, I think, isn't it? Most people wanted to go into oil when I was at university. I don't think it was a particularly good time for oil. But for me, it seemed the exploration geology was the exciting end of the geological careers. The fact that you could be, surveying kind of outcrops, flying around in helicopters, sounded. I mean, I don't even think you need to be paid for that, to be honest. It seems like such an adventure.
It was very much and has been always great for people who want to be in the outdoors, but there's lots of room also for those people that want to stick in front of a computer and do technical work, Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was kind of along so some people wanted to go in the, volcanology, that sort of area, but we were kind of told, well, in a real terms, it's kind of there's Excel spreadsheets and it's a lot more desk based. There are some occasional visits, but it's not quite as we thought, at least as students, as it kind of was. So, as a recognized authority on BIM rocks, block and matrix rocks, what initially drew you to studying these complex geological formations?
Oh, well, that's another lurch in my random walk of a career. I was based in Hawaii in the 80s, and I was asked to go on a job to California for a few weeks. It was actually the biggest earthwork project in the San Francisco Bay Area that year. And I was asked to sort of train a bunch of guys up and, watch the bulldozers and the compaction tests and interact with the client and whatnot. Straightforward job. And when I got there, it became very complicated very, very quickly. We were excavating into something called Franciscan complex melange, which I had never seen anything like this in my life. This sheared mass of shale and rocks of different sizes, and so it became very difficult excavating, and it looked like fault zones. The project was very high profile, and the city of South San Francisco, which is where the project was located, had hired a top-notch, world-class consultant to watch my work, and they were all PhDs, literally, 5 of them, all PhDs, and I very quickly felt very stupid. They were challenging everything I was saying, and it got very, very bad. And I actually got fired on that job for being so difficult to work with. They asked me back a week later because they really needed me. But anyway, so I felt so stupid. I went back to school at the age of 42. I went to University of California at Berkeley to do a master's. And after about 5 months of that, I realized I wasn't going to finish the program any more knowledgeable or comfortable with geotechnical engineering. So I decided to carry on and do a PhD, not really knowing what I would research. And along the way, Dr. Dick Goodman, Professor Goodman, asked me to work on this project of fundamental engineering and characterization problems of melange. So yes, because my name Medley means mixture, and melange means mixture, and it was first called melange by a geologist studying geology of North Wales, Edward Greenlee, in 1919, and my heritage as well. But it all felt cosmic. So that's how I started to work in it, and then I developed my own ideas about the universal fabric of complex fabric of blocks of hard stuff surrounded by weak stuff. What are the mechanical behaviors of those materials, which was covered by my colleague, Eric Lindquist, but also how do you characterize this stuff? So that's how the field developed, and I came up with the word BIM rocks to describe this fundamental fabric of chaos without using geological words, which really put engineers off. So I came up with a nonsense word just to focus engineers' attention. And I never realized how interestingly provocative it would be. 30 years later, there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of papers on BIM rocks and BIM soils and soil rock mixtures. That's how it started.
So, what you described there in relation to your feeling silly when you were in that particular post, which must have been horrible, and quite a negative experience for you. But then, it's kind of propelled you into going back to school and then further it on even more so as a PhD. So, turning a negative into a positive, really.
Yeah, it's actually the story of my life. People telling me I can't do something or I'm stupid or whatever is usually said, "Oh well, screw you. Let me show you."
I often find that's the best kind of motivation you can have, for someone to say something like that you can't do that. is really the thing. Yeah, because if everyone kind of condones everything and agrees with everything, it's not as interesting, I don't think. So
Right.
you've worked on projects involving landslides, erosion, subsurface characterization. Which of these areas do you find most rewarding and why?
Oh, I love characterization. I love site investigation. I'm not a technical person. I, I still don't like math or analysis. I've always been in the field my whole life, and all of my jobs, even at principal level, has I've always been in the field. That's where I thrill. Um, I just enjoy. It's like a characterization for me. It's like a putting together the pieces of a puzzle. But first, you have to find the pieces of the puzzle, facts, the information, the data, and start creating a picture of the subsurface, the ground model. A wonderful work by Fuchs and other people on the idea of developing ground model. His gossip lecture, for instance, is one of my inspirations. Um, and the idea of coming up with a 3D kind of feeling of ground. But we're so wrong. We think we know what's down in the ground based on our borings and our GPR and all the stuff that we do. But we usually have it wrong. But as long as we understand that we've got it wrong, it opens us up to saying, okay, well, what are we going to do if this goes, this happens or this happens, and the observational approach.
How has technology like GIS and photogrammetry influenced your approach to geological and geotechnical investigations?
Well, I started with air photos in 1969. And so air photos, and particularly stereo photo analysis, has been a fundamental part. It still is. And in fact, I bemoan the fact that most geologists, and certainly very, very few geotechnical engineers, do any stereo photo analysis. You look on Google and you look at the two-dimensional stuff, and that's it. But to me, 3D is the way to go. And in fact, I'm one of the very, very few people I know who actually take stereo photos in the field, of right outcrops or people's faces or whatever. Very, very useful to be able to look at stuff in stereo. Over the years, I've become a very fond patron of at least one GIS program. I'm very much in a part of my work. Um, I I see where the development of LiDAR in particular. I've done some fascinating work with digital photogrammetry and airborne LiDAR with a colleague of mine, Dr. Bill Hanneberg, particularly in the jungles of Papua New Guinea on one particular project. We were some of the first people to actually try to get some terrain analysis out of extremely dense jungle. And so LiDAR, and nowadays, the way the technology is now evolved for AI, which I use personally more and more in my own stuff. But now the idea of using, what is it, GeoGPT. Um, it's a lot of controversy about it. There was the winter edition of the Geological Society, the publication Geosciences, gave some conflicting views about the use of GeoGPT. But I see that's the way we're going. Any tool that allows us to visualize the subsurface is really worth having, as long as we're humble enough to say, well, where is it wrong? How can we test it? That's the important thing. Working with students over the years and the young people, the ability to be able to print out colorful cross-section, cross-analysis, and slope stability analysis, and believe what the computer is producing, and to keep telling them that, it's just a pretty picture. You have to question it. And I think that's one of the risks of technology, is that we get too carried off on its apparent veracity.
Yeah. So you mentioned AI. How would you use AI at the moment?
Well, at the moment, I have lots of fun researching BIMROCs with AI. For instance, I use Gemini a lot, and Notebook LM, and and just say, okay, all right, summarize a bunch of papers for me, and I look to see how wrong it can get. It's an arrogant thing. I like looking at my own name or my own work. But the idea of, for instance, of AI, of pattern recognition, say in satellite photos, in 3D. I mean, it's not beyond it's happening. I mean, be able to take boring data and start to put together pictures. Of course, in my world, boring data is very dangerous because you can drill into blocks here and blend into blocks there, and people like to draw a straight line between their borings, and there's not strata; these are blocks. But I can see where we could go. AI is going to go that way, where it'll do that grunt work for us, and I don't know how to do it, but I'm sure it's been done. But just researching the geology, being able to pull together old maps, old data. I mean, the British Geological Survey is fantastic at doing like GIS and integrating data, or historical data. But I can see it just getting more and more wonderful as time goes on.
Yeah, it's kind of, even though it's been out 4 years, I read someone the other day it's been out for 20 odd years. It seems like it's only been out, the last year or so to me, but where it's been kind of utilized by, the everyday person essentially. But yeah, it's exciting things ahead, I think, in relation to AI, and especially to do some of the more boring things where it's analyzing, some pictures.
Boring.
Yes. Analyzing some of the pictures which may, turn the most of us, going to sleep. But yeah, certainly the future of it seems exciting.
There's always the need for the bloke or the lady to go out into the field and just see what is the terrain doing for me? What are the rocks speaking? Because I'm just, I don't want old farts like myself who are field people to just be technologied out. There's always going to be a place for the jack of all trades, and that's what I am. I'm an ed of all trades, really. It, we can't get too off on the technology. It always comes back to the site. Anyway.
Yeah, definitely. So, as the 2009 Richard Hay Johns Distinguished Lecturer, what key messages did you aim to impact to students and professionals?
Well, let me just say, Dick Jones was a famous professor at Stanford University. He was the dean of earth sciences at one time. He had a august career, particularly in what do they call strategic minerals during the Second World War, prospecting for them. And anyway, so he was essentially a mineralogist, but had learned a lot about site work and engineering and geology. So he was an incredibly funny guy, very fantastic mentor, particularly in his work for engineering geology. So I had a heritage, and so to follow up on, and my messages to the couple of thousand, 2,000 to 3,000 people I lectured to over that year at about 85 different venues, was the value of going into engineering geology. So, many of the students were undergraduates in geology or civil engineering. And what I was trying to do is excite them about the field of engineering geology, geotechnical engineering. So that was one of my missions. That, in fact, is one of the intent. The lectureship is sponsored by the Geological Society of America and the Association of Engineering Geologists. It's a pretty big deal, so it made me feel pretty good, actually. But the chance to try to excite students in particular about applied earth sciences, that's really what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I think every industry or profession needs a teacher or a lecturer who can instill the enthusiasm, because otherwise, less people essentially go into it. So you've written about the importance of curiosity, humility, and honesty in investigating geofailures. Can you elaborate on why these traits are essential?
Yeah, it's a very appealing field to go into to become a failure investigator. Become perhaps in a litigation area an expert witness. It looks like easy work, right? Incredibly great billing rates, and you go out and you look around and then you spout off your opinions and you get paid lots of money, right? So there are a lot of challenges in the field. So to be effective, I talked earlier about the idea of building the picture, that you find pieces of a puzzle and create a picture. So being curious enough to look for those pieces. There are ground failures that look so bloody obvious when you go in. You go, oh, okay, well, there's a landslide and somebody left their hose running for a weekend when they're out, and on the headscarf, and so the failure occurred because they left the hose on, and that's it. That's your opinion. You have to be more open-minded. You have to be able to say, okay, I really don't know what the cause is right now. Let me poke around. Let me be curious and go and explore. So that's I think a personal trait that you have to have is to say, what is that? Why is that? Where is that? So that's the first thing. Be curious enough to go poking around. The second thing is that humility is really important, because you may feel that you know what you know, but you may not know what you don't know. That's tremendously dangerous. And there are lots of people out there that I've met, particularly PhDs. They go out into practice and they really don't know what they don't know. But they should know what they don't know. Even more dangerous are people with master's degrees from really, really fine universities who in their master's degrees have learned that the stuff that they learned in their undergraduate degree is not really true. But because this program's so hard and these professors are so famous, and when I finish my master's degree, I'm going to really know everything. Right? Well, it helps to be more humble and say, well, maybe I really don't know what I think I know. And that helps you to sort of say, okay, well, let me look at this a different way. Let me go ask other people. Let me go and ask colleagues in another area of the geo practice. And then honesty is paramount, because you have to be honest enough to say, I don't know something. And number two, particularly when it comes to litigation or any kind of dispute, the parties take their positions. And if you're hired by one party, there's a natural tendency for them to want to you to advocate for them, that for you to see what it is that's in their best interest. And you have to be honest enough with them to say, no, you've got it wrong. I'm sorry. You have to take it. I've been fired on several projects. I've been fired career-wise from jobs for being, not a member of the team, and saying, Mr. Lawyer, your thesis, your theory doesn't work, and this is why. And a good attorney, for instance, will say, I really value that, because the expert on the other side, I need to think about what he may or she may be coming up with, and then you can help them think that through. So honesty has a place.
Yeah, there's certainly good traits to have and have its use. But yeah, I mean, I suppose if you engage one party to say one particular thing, then it's in their interest, I suppose, financially as well, isn't it? To kind of go along with that. So
I'll just add one thing. Honesty is very important, particularly when you're starting out your career. Your boss may ask you to do a project, and you're bewildered. And you go, oh, gee, how am I going to do this? And you kind of bumble your way through, and the boss pops his office into her head into your office and say, how's it going? How you doing? Oh, I'm going fine. It's fine. It's fine. But you don't know how to do it. It's a time to be honest. Say, I don't know. Help me.
yes, definitely. I hear before. I suppose it's more in a business sense where people say, can you do this? And you say yes, and then quickly work it out. But if you had a client and you said that, and then all of a sudden you have to go back a week later, sorry, I don't actually know, then reputation is very quick to destroy. It's very hard to build, isn't it? What qualities do you admire most in young geotechnical and geological professionals based on your experience recruiting and mentoring over 30 individuals?
I am very drawn to feisty, impish, furious, rebellious candidates. It's a particular failing of mine. So spirited young people. But then because I know I'm drawn to that, then I'm not swayed. They're a bit like me, so I know I have problems, so I know they have problems. So I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to courage. I'm drawn to people who have overcome some adversities, who have gone back to school when they're older. I mean, I was 46 when I got my PhD. So, I mean, I understand what it's like to go back to school, saying to yourself, I need the education, then we go back. I'm drawn to people who have, who want to succeed, even though they may have, well, it's probably not politically correct to say this anymore, handicap. I have a very severe hearing loss. And so it seems like that to most people, but it's been a bit of a burden sometimes in my life. The people who they come from another country. I'm very partial to immigrants who have to learn to speak our language, who are trying to get registered in our country, or chartered or licensed or whatever. Who I feel that those folks have got something more than I have, that have more than some other people. They've got grit, determination. So
I suppose they've had to work harder than someone else, especially if they're if they're already a resident of a country, then they have to learn language. I remember I went to university and English, they couldn't really understand too much English, but yet they would sit in the lecture halls. They would have to work it out. They'd done very well in a degree anyway, went on to great things. And you think that's so much harder than what we have to do. And it was hard enough for us. So the grit and determination, is something that's absolutely ideal.
and you mentioned the word mentoring. Um, Mentoring's a big deal. It's a big area for people to make money in. I hate the expression mentoring mentee. Mentee is not even a real world. Mentor was this old guy who was a advisor to Telemachus, who was Odysseus' son. So Odysseus goes off to do his 10 years, right, fighting the Trojan War, right, and his poor mum is battling off all these suitors, and Mentor was this advisor to Telemachus, and and Telemachus was his protege. He protected him. So I think about mentoring a little differently. I don't see it as something that can be set up by a consulting firm and just plug two people together. It's a chemical reaction between you and another person. And that person doesn't have to be younger. And so I've had a number of proteges in my life, and I get tremendous satisfaction out of seeing them, succeed in their life, even if they ignore every single piece of advice I've given them. It so that's how I feel about mentoring. It's a close relationship. I abhor the whole issue of that. It's a business benefit. Human resources say, "Oh, we have a mentoring program." Is if that's enough for you to join the firm.
I've had a few kind of mentors, even though you don't like that word, or kind of advisors in the recruitment world. And there's always a bit of me. With their kind of 30 years experience or more, tell me about something. And then at some point I'll decide, no, I'm going to do it a slightly different way. But I think that's a kind of entrepreneurial spirit to a point. But also there is a good reason to listen to people with dramatically more experience and have been through those things which we're going through as well. So you've worked internationally from Canada to Papua New Guinea to the UK. What cultural and regional differences in geotechnical practices have you found most striking?
The variety in standards and prescriptive practices, what you are expected to do, what you have to adhere to, what protocols you have to adhere to. So, for instance, in California, we're probably a little bit more loosey-goosey than we are in the UK. The standards are different. And also, I find the differences in understanding of geology. For instance, if I'm working in Canada, then I'm working with geotechnical engineers and geologists, I'm expecting the understanding of geology can be very striking in places, depending on where they're coming from, what their academic background is. There are for geotechnical engineers, the differences in professional registration is extremely marked. What is expected, how you're licensed. I mean, in the US, it's licensing, and in Canada, it's registration, and of course, it's chartering. And I have been, up until recently anyway, I had professional registrations in Canada for 42 years. But I'm licensed in California, and I'm a chartered geologist and a chartered engineer in the UK. So the expectation, the differences, and how difficult it is to get those registrations is very, very marked. Which is just because you're licensed in California, you stand that much chance of getting chartered in the UK. So, that's a very striking difference.
Based on your limited experiences with UK field practices, why did you find them foreign or frustrating compared to North American approaches?
I did a few projects in the UK in the 80s, and what I found really different was the practice of sending a driller out with a cable percussion rig to go out and investigate soil and then bring samples back in jars. I don't know if that's common now, but cable percussion rigs, you never see them here, number one. Number two, here, we're standing on the drill rig and we log the soil as it comes out of the ground or the core, and we select our own samples and we protect them and we make sure they get to the lab. That for me was a very, very significant difference. The standards and regulations are different. In the UK, for instance, British standard, the expectations are much more rigid, I would say. They're more constricted. They're more guidance than perhaps in my experience in California or in Hawaii or Idaho or the other places I've worked. The other difference, based on my experience in the UK, was I had never worked with women before. And in the UK, I had one job where the entire crew were women, all women except for me. And that was striking. I mean, it was great. And I liked it very much. But it was not something that I had ever seen before in the US.
And are you referring to on a drilling rig here, or are you referring to engineers?
In engineering, this was on not on drilling, but this was on a pumping test for trial caissons in what was to be Canary Wharf. So they were still demolishing the docklands, and so there were big scale pumping tests, and I was managing that project. And so there were 4 people helping me, different professions. So that wasn't drilling as such. Where we also soils engineers not wanting to touch soil. I was doing some test pitting in Essex and doing some plate loading tests, and a couple of geotechnical engineers came by from the client and the owner, and I said, "Hey, pop down into the trench." No. Well, yeah. How about this? What do you feel about this soil? No, they wouldn't even touch it. Which led to some discussion on my part with them. Well, how can you be soils engineers, geotechnical engineers, if you don't want to touch dirt? Now, it may just be me being, a bit of a jerk, but nevertheless, I found that to be sort of, wow, that's very different.
I suppose you need to have a feel of the soil. I mean, what depth was the trench at though?
3 feet, definitely 4 feet. I mean, here in California, you can't go into a trench deeper than 4 feet unless it's shored. So, the trench is 3 feet deep. It was not very deep at all. That's something that's changed over the years. I used to go down in backhoes, hydraulic excavators down to 23, 24 feet in the bucket to log test pits. Now, can't do that anymore, can you?
Fired in an instant for anything, doing anything like that. And I don't think there's many people that have been killed by going into a trial pit, but I think it has happened. But depending on what the soil is, made ground, or it's cohesive, the grain size, that sort of thing, then yeah, it's not only frowned upon, is quite dangerous. The larger the company, the more kind of procedures have in place to not allow that to ever happen. Sometimes in the smaller companies, there's a little bit of a cowboy attitude, and that stuff can still happen only to a degree. But in relation to, women, I mean, of course, there's a lot of women, of course, in the industry. We have some clients with 40-50% women, some with more women than there are men, whether it's consultants, whether it's being out on site. Obviously, there is a difference, despite no one wanting to ever admit it anymore. There are differences between men and women, and so that can be a useful thing as well. What do you see as the biggest challenge for geotechnical engineers in a globalized profession?
Well, at the globe, there's lots of different countries and there's lots of different ways of doing things. I think that sending a UK engineering geologist or geotech engineer to work in San Francisco is a kind of a challenge. And I say that from personal experience because I've worked with UK. They have an expectation about how way things are done, but it's very much looser and more, working with drillers, and so there are things and bad things. The globalization is absolutely necessary. It's good to bring other practices, other ways of doing things, other rigor, to have more rigor, more standards on international projects. Of course it is. I have profound wonder at the way things are done in Europe and in the UK. I mean, I read my engineering magazine, my institution newsletters and magazines, and I'm absolutely gobsmacked by the fantastic, the tunnels and the infrastructure stuff they say in the UK. Whereas here, we had a tunnel done that was maybe, I don't know, a kilometer long. It took 20 years. It was 4 years late. It was like treble the price. It was mayhem. And everybody was raving about this innovative, incredible tunneling technique. And so, sometimes we're a bit backward here. So globalization is a good thing. It brings new ideas, fresh way of thinking. The other, I think, a big problem though is addressing staff shortages. And so this is where I think importing your staff, and that's a big issue, of course, in the United States right now, with the new political regime. But the global problem of finding staff can be solved globally if one is prepared to hire folk from different places and maybe have to retrain them. But you've got these folk who are really, really willing to show how well they can work.
So in your first point now, in terms of, going from the UK to California, or being international, essentially, we have clients who are based in Australia, particularly keen for people from the UK to go over there and take up positions over there, because I think the standards are very similar. But yeah, it seems to be really popular in terms of the finding your skills, finding your people to, fulfill roles in your company from outside of the country. There's always a skill shortage here in the UK, and I suppose it is everywhere else in the world where we work as well. And it always puzzles me. We'll speak to people, and even people perhaps from Australia, where I think it's 2 or 3 years, practically, visa free, or hassle free in relation to the visas. And companies will say to us that we don't want to take the person on because they're only allowed to stay here for 3 years. But if you look at their median tenure, perhaps on LinkedIn, it's 2.5 years. So even if they stayed to 3 years, it's actually doing better than what your company have done for the last 12 years, or however long they've been running for. So yeah, it's certainly good to pull people from outside. And I suppose there could be a cultural thing, but you would select people based on their skill set, but also their personality, how they come across, standards that, attitude, health and safety can be a big one as well. But yeah, I mean, there's so many additional people outside your own country. It seems silly, but
Well, you have to be humble and you have to be curious to, let me try these people out. Or maybe it helps if you're an immigrant and you come from somewhere else. You know?
I think the route in the door in the UK, especially for people from Australia and New Zealand, is they come over here, they'll work on a freelance basis, so we can get them out to do ground investigations, and then they have the experience of being in the UK. They have the qualifications specific to the UK. So at that point, it seems to be a much easier decision for companies to make. But it depends on the size of the company as well. The larger companies are a little bit more lenient, and it depends on the open-mindedness, the individual who's going to kind of sign off on actually taking that person on. But yeah, it's something. It's something definitely should be looked at, I feel, more strongly from people in the UK and people worldwide.
Well, if Australia in particular, if I remember rightly, Australian Institution of Civil Engineer, they're closer to the UK standard, right? But if you want to bring an American in who's licensed, maybe in California, to work at a management position, say in London, he wants to get licensed. I had a horrible experience getting chartered with the institution. One of the most I got 10 I had one recently 10 licenses, and the institution one was incredibly difficult to get. And in fact, they failed me, and then I protested because they said no, right? So I fight that, and it was Jean Venables who was then a senior reviewer for she's now Dame Jean Venables, who said, "Whoa, there's something wrong here." And so they had to reconsider me. But that issue of people trying to continue their professional development in another country and by getting licensed and stuff, that has to sort of try to get sorted out a bit.
Sure. You've written about the diminishing understanding in geotechnical engineering. Why do you think this gap has widened, and how can the industry address it?
Well, it's widened because the challenges of the world have increased so much. Geological engineering was the resource industries, and when I was mostly anyway, the challenges with infrastructure, with environmental issues, with climate change, with our addresses to battle what the problems that are coming up require more and more specialized attention. The development of those tools themselves, the GIS and the computer programs, in particular computing, is that you have these fancy tools. So, it just takes, you have more training and people have to be specialized to use the technical tools. And we have to know about the tools. And so that takes us further away from, the prospect of, working in the field kind of geological engineer, right? Academic specialization. Professors have to make themselves famous for something. So, they specialize. They come up, they go to school and they come up with BIMROC. Right? I mean, it's a natural entropy, if you want to call it that way. Start with something nice and homogeneous called geotechnical engineering as a mixture of groundwater and rock mechanics and soil mechanics. And entropy will demand it'll just get more and more chaotic. It's a good thing in some ways, but it's for somebody like me, I go, well, you still need the person who kind of has the big picture.
Yeah. Great. So, question about sustainability. Sustainability is a growing focus in engineering in general. How can geotechnical engineers integrate sustainability into their work without compromising practicality?
Well, that's a big tension, isn't it? Money and more money. I'm not so sure I really like the word sustainability. It's a kind of a passive word. Sustaining the way that we are. Now, of course, what it means, of course, is living our lives so that we can sustain future generations. I think that we in the geo practice, have to be thinking about geo-adaptability, which is much more active. In fact, geo-intervention, and then eventually geo-survivorship, survivability. We are having to help. It probably would help to see some movies and read some of the books that are coming out about the likely effects of climate change. But I mean, we can sort of see what we're going to need. We're going to need major water intervention. We're going to need livability, for instance, perhaps a lot more underground space, perhaps earth structures, like actual, making habitation out of soil, coastal protection, of course, moving community. How are we going to do that? The reuse of materials, mining landfills. I worked for a firm for a number of years whose main thing was landfills. That was a big what we were known for, and they did not like me telling them that we should be working towards helping your client sort out materials in such a way that you know where they are in the landfill, because one day they're going to be mined. So, the mining of landfills could be a big deal one day. I mean, just thinking along those lines of where can we adapt, geo-adaptability, geo-intervention, rather than this sort of sustainability. Does any of that help? I don't know. That's the way I feel.
I'm liking kind of some new words still, or some new words I've kind of learned along that way in terms of geos, that sort of thing. But I liked it. I think maybe they should be used more, but it's kind of a different slant on it. So you've worked on some fascinating projects, including retrieving artifacts from lava tubes in Hawaii and investigating sea cliff sewer failure. What's the story from these experiences which have stayed with you?
Well, the sea cliff incident, so that 30 years ago, December of 1995, a 100-year sewer failed in the middle of the night for the first time in a little itsy bitsy storm, the first one of the winter. And it probably developed well, let me just tell you, 200 feet wide. So what's that? 8 meters, 60 meters, 60 meters wide, 40 feet deep, 13 meters deep. Huge, great pit, swallowed houses, $30 million worth of public infrastructure. The story that came in my mind from that one story, this was an incredible failure. It wasn't clear at all what caused it. And I remember sitting there. I'd only been with the firm, Exponent, Failure Analysis Associate, about 3 or 4 months, sitting at the edge of this pit, looking down into this chaos. And the president of the firm came by and he said, "Ed, what happened?" Oh, so I had this amazing ignorance for quite a while. It was a hell of a project to figure out. But one of the things I remember was that before the failure, sewers had been gushing out of manholes, and Seacliff is a fancy part of San Francisco. And so there were rivers of sewage running in the street. And so right after the failure, I walking around trying to come up with inspiration. I started mapping toilet paper in people's front yards. And so this took me back to the days as a prospector when I used to crack float. And that's when you walk up drainage streams and hit cobbles and find mineralization, and you keep on going until you get to a fork in the stream, and you go up one fork, and you no more mineralization, so you backtrack and go. It's called cracking float. So that's an indelible image in my mind, and also a few other people who watched me going around mapping and picking up pieces of toilet paper and finding out how high they were off the ground. There's a story.
That is, yeah. I mean, it's definitely not what I expected for you to say for that one.
Let me just say, yeah, the lava tube thing was a huge issue. It was a huge deal in Hawaii, and one of those very controversial. It was where some famous priceless artifacts had basically been borrowed but never returned from the Bishop Museum and put back where they had come from about 100 years earlier, and locked in with stone walls. And it was a federal case, and the judge had been told that by the guys that did it, that if anybody went into the lava tubes to retrieve them, then the lava tubes would collapse and the people would die. There was a taboo. And so I went in. It was perfectly safe. And so before every morning for 5 days, there was a circle of about 25 people just after dawn, including myself and my colleagues, now Dr. Julian Weber. And there were early morning prayers in Hawaiian by a Hawaiian kahuna. and with these guys with their rifles, they put their rifles down on the ground, and that was like an amazing project just from the cultural sensitivity issues. Anyway, there's two stories.
Yeah. I mean, you're gonna have to send me some literature on that so I can, add that to the podcast. I think maybe as a link, because that's a fascinating story as well. So
I'd never told the story in Hawaii. There was actually a paper. It was a redacted version of the public report, and I'd never given the story in Hawaii. I had given presentations on it. It's a very emotional story, because when we retrieved the artifact, myself and a representative of Bishop Museum were in this cave. We had a little bit of light coming from a little lantern, and she was unwrapping these incredible carving and talking to them. And it's very emotional. She hadn't seen these for like 5 or 6 years, and so now her friends were back, Anyway, yeah, I'll
yeah, definitely, because I think people would love some kind of link and maybe in the podcast notes to read up a little bit more about that. So
Okay.
Your articles and lectures often blend technical expertise with humor and storytelling. How do you balance this seriousness with a light-hearted in your professional life?
I balance it. I'm a buffoon. And therein lies a bit of a stunt. People sometimes don't take me seriously because I'm a buffoon. On one of my projects, like the toilet paper project, I was called Dr. Colombo. I was walking around with a tweed jacket, and because I'm hard of hearing, when I interview people, I'm imagining I have a movie in my mind that they're telling me things, and then there were gaps, and so I said, "Okay, now you said just a few moments ago you said something," and so they have to tell me, a bit like Colombo, bit of a buffoon, right? Okay, um, but I'm not always a buffoon. So when it comes to presentations, I like to give humor because they make them memorable. Dr. Ray Seed, one of my professors at Berkeley, had this thing he did to explain capillarity. You know how water goes up a tube, and he used to go like with his arms, like he was basically climbing up the side of a tube. I have never forgotten that. And so to add humor to make things memorable, and people have told me, I've given over 350 lectures, and have told me that, it's the most memorable thing lecture. I remember those things years later. They remember things I say. So that's how I use humor. But obviously, I'm not like that all the time. And sometimes I'm very serious. And then people know when I'm being serious because I'm not being a buffoon.
Yeah. No, yeah, to use humor is good, but of course, you're clearly not a buffoon, but we all have our moments of kind of tomfoolery and a bit of humor as well, and that's just as important, I think. So what lessons have you learned from career roadblocks like being fired, which you mentioned earlier, that you think are valuable for younger professionals?
Get fired. Yeah. Get fired. It's okay. Get divorced. Lose somebody precious to you. I mean, these are life experiences. You can't avoid them. You don't necessarily, I'm not telling you go get fired. Get fired if something happens to you in your job. And for instance, if you see something or you see something and you say something and your boss doesn't like it and he fires you, then okay, then you've done something honorable. If, however, you're a duper and you're goofing off, then you deserve to be fired. So learn from it. And so I see these sorts of when we have these, I call them career roadblock. It's like you're driving along on your freeway, on your wonderful career that you've mapped out, and suddenly there's a traffic jam or a crash ahead of you, and you have to peel off at the next exit, and you're lost, and you don't know where you are. Then you actually learn. The more of these roadblocks happen, the more you learn how to navigate when you're off the freeway. So having roadblocks like these is good for you. Makes you a more mature person, more resilient. And so, some people have never had anything bad happen to their life, and then when something bad does happen, it wrecks them.
From board. Yeah, I know what you mean. some people, as you potentially think, had an unfortunate existence in a way. Actually, Keanu Reeves, bizarrely, is a reference what I think of in terms of his, extreme loss of family members and all the rest of it. And he seems such a happy, content bloke. And you think, how the hell how can you be happy and content with all of these seemingly horrific things that happened? I think death of family members, etc. But anyway,
I'll say one thing, and this maybe is germane. Don't fall in love with your employer, because you may very well get jilted. And so that's one thing I've learned. I had 40, I stopped counting them now. I had 43 jobs, and I got fired 5 times. And so a couple of those were with employers that I was gobsmacked that I was fired. So I sort of learned not to love employers, head over heels.
head over heels. No, it's frowned upon. I think it's even discouraged here in the UK.
Well, oh, right. Yeah.
But you can't plan for love. Can you? It can
No.
be spontaneous.
Yeah.
So if you're entering the profession today, what aspect of the geotechnical or geological engineering would you focus on?
Characterization. Still. Yeah. That's what I would focus. If I was entering it, I still think there's a place for the field-oriented person, particularly if you like the outdoors, is to spend time looking at rock and soil and terrain and water in real life. But lots of people don't like the field. I've seen people crying in the office coming back from working on construction site because they didn't like the nasty workmen or being looked at, or, okay, some people just temperamentally are not, they're not, it's not going to be good for them. But if I was entering the field, I would still say, try to get a job where you can get lots of field experience.
Okay, well, that's going to bring us to the end. Thank you very much for your time. There was an additional question there, but I think we've kind of answered that. But recording this for you today has been very good, very enjoyable. You have a huge amount of experience, some great stories and anecdotes, which the audience will love, I'm sure. So thank you very much for your time, Ed.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.